Welcome to Whispers After Midnight. Tonight's story takes us deep into the heart of Mississippi, where cruelty wasn't just a punishment, it was entertainment. On this plantation, the master had a sick ritual. He always chose the weakest enslaved person to fight, just to watch them break in front of everyone. But one night, he chose wrong. Before we step into this dark chapter, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? And if you enjoy true horror history like this, subscribe, because finding real details and building these stories takes a lot of digging, research, and effort to bring you chilling, accurate storytelling every time. Mississippi in the slave-era South was a place where power didn't just live in laws, it lived in whips, fear, silence, and control. A plantation wasn't simply land with crops. It was a private kingdom where the master's word acted like a law no one could challenge. Enslaved people were treated not as human beings, but as property, something to buy, sell, punish, and destroy without consequence. And the most horrifying part wasn't only the physical suffering, it was the psychological terror built into daily life. Waking up knowing your body didn't belong to you, knowing your family could be separated in a single moment, knowing even your tears could be seen as disrespect. On plantations like this, cruelty became a weapon the master used to keep everyone obedient. He didn't need to punish everyone. He only needed to punish one person publicly, to remind the rest that resistance meant pain. The fields were a prison without walls. The cabins were cages disguised as homes, and the night was the only time some enslaved souls could whisper their real thoughts. But even the night wasn't safe, because the master's power reached everywhere, through overseers, patrols, threats, and the constant feeling of being watched. In that world, fear wasn't an emotion, it was the system. And the master? He didn't just want work from the enslaved, he wanted control over their spirit, their hope, their dignity. That's why he created rituals of humiliation and violence, not because he had to, but because it proved to him, again and again, that he could break a human being and still sleep peacefully afterward. And in Mississippi, where plantations stretched like endless graves across the land, men like him weren't rare, they were protected by a society built to keep that darkness alive. On this plantation, the fighting wasn't random violence. It was scheduled, expected, like a sickness that returned every week. The enslaved people didn't call it a game, because there was nothing playful about it. They called it a ritual because it happened with the same cruel pattern, the same steps, the same silence, like the master was performing a twisted tradition that fed something dark inside him. It always started the same way. Near the end of the workday, when bodies were already exhausted, backs were already aching, and the air smelled of sweat and dirt, word would spread through the quarters like a cold wind. Tonight. No one had to say more. That single word meant the master was in the mood. And when the master was in the mood, somebody was going to suffer. Men and boys were forced to gather in an open area of the plantation, sometimes near the barns, sometimes near the clearing where the ground was hard and bare. The master wanted visibility. He wanted an audience. Because the point wasn't just violence, the point was control through fear. He needed every enslaved person to witness it, to feel powerless, to know that their lives could be turned into a spectacle. Whenever he felt bored, the master would arrive like it was entertainment night. Sometimes he brought guests. Sometimes he drank. Sometimes he laughed too loudly, like suffering was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. Overseers stood nearby, armed and ready, making sure no one moved, no one spoke, no one looked away. Even the ones who weren't chosen were punished in a different way, forced to stand there and watch, because watching someone else break was its own kind of torture. And then came the worst part, the choosing. The master didn't just pick fighters, he selected victims. He made a show of it too, walking slowly, scanning faces, studying bodies like he was picking livestock. He already knew who was scared. He already knew who was injured. He could see the ones who were hungry, weak, trembling. And that's exactly who he wanted. Because the ritual wasn't meant to be fair. It was meant to be public humiliation. The chosen person would be pulled forward, sometimes shoved into the dirt, sometimes slapped just to remind them they had no right to stand proud. Then the master would choose someone bigger, stronger, healthier, a guaranteed winner. Not because the master wanted a real fight, but because he wanted to watch the weak person fall quickly, painfully, and in front of everyone. The enslaved people knew what came next. They could read it in the master's posture, in his smile, in the way he leaned forward when the first blow landed. The master wasn't just observing, he was feeding on it. The fear, the desperation, the helplessness, and when the weak fighter finally collapsed, because they almost always did, the ritual didn't end with mercy. That's what made it even more horrifying. If the weak one fell too fast, the master called them useless. If they cried out, he called them pathetic. If they tried to defend themselves, he called it defiance. No matter what they did, the master always found a reason to punish them more afterward. Sometimes it ended with lashes. Sometimes it ended with chains. Sometimes it ended with the chosen person dragged away like broken furniture. And the others, they had to return to their cabins afterward and pretend they could sleep, knowing next week the master could point at someone else and do it all over again. That's why it became a ritual. Because the master didn't just want obedience, he wanted something deeper, hopelessness. He wanted the enslaved people to stop believing in strength, stop believing in justice, stop believing in tomorrow. He wanted them to feel weak even when they were strong. But what the master didn't realize, what he never understood, is that when you repeat cruelty long enough, you don't just create fear. You create something else. A quiet, burning rage that waits for one mistake. And that's exactly what happened. The weak, he chose the wrong one. The master didn't choose the weakest by accident. He chose them on purpose, every time, because the weakest person wasn't just an easy target, they were a message. On that plantation, strength wasn't only physical. Strength was hope. Strength was dignity. Strength was the ability to stand tall, even when the world wanted you on your knees. And the master hated that. He hated anything that reminded him enslaved people were human beings with hearts, pride, families, and souls that could not be owned. So he hunted the weak the way a predator hunts the injured. He watched carefully. He noticed who limped in the fields, who coughed too long at night, who moved slower than the others, who looked smaller, younger, thinner, or exhausted beyond words. Not because he felt concern, because he saw opportunity. To him, weakness was entertainment. Weakness was proof that his power worked. When he chose someone fragile, the outcome was almost guaranteed, and that guarantee made him feel invincible. It was his way of saying, "Look what I can do. Look how easily I can crush someone, and no one can stop me." The cruel genius of it was psychological. Because the weakest enslaved person often wasn't weak by nature. They were weak because the system made them that way. Hunger did it. Sleeplessness did it. Constant labor did it. Injuries left untreated did it. Grief did it. Trauma did it. The master created the weakness and then punished people for having it. And when he chose the weakest, Everyone watching felt the sickness of it. Not just because they feared the bloodshed, but because they understood the deeper horror. If the weakest could be destroyed for entertainment, then no one was safe. Not the injured, not the sick, not the young, not even the elderly. The master wanted the crowd to think, if he can do that to them, he can do that to me. And that fear created silence. Silence created obedience. Even the stronger, enslaved men, those who could have fought hard, often looked away or kept their faces blank, because they knew what happened to anyone who stood out. Strength attracted attention, and attention on a plantation like this could be a death sentence. The master knew that too. That's why he never picked the strongest first. Because if he allowed the strong to win, even once, it would plant a dangerous seed in everyone's mind. A seed called possibility. So instead, he chose the weak to make sure. The ending always looked the same. Weakness collapses, power laughs, hope dies. But the darkest part, sometimes he chose the weakest for reasons that had nothing to do with bodies, and everything to do with spirit. He'd choose someone who didn't lower their eyes fast enough. Someone who stood still instead of trembling. Someone who helped another enslaved person secretly. Someone who carried quiet pride like a hidden flame. Those were the ones he feared the most. Because deep down, the master understood something he would never admit. The most dangerous person isn't always the strongest. Sometimes, the most dangerous person is the one who has been pushed so far down, they no longer fear falling. And that's exactly why on that one night, when he pointed at someone weak, he didn't realize he wasn't choosing a victim. He was choosing the beginning of his own nightmare. For the master, the violence wasn't enough. Pain alone didn't satisfy him. What he wanted most was humiliation. Because humiliation doesn't just hurt the body, it attacks the soul. It strips a person of dignity in front of witnesses. It turns suffering into a spectacle. And on this plantation, the master didn't just want enslaved people to obey. He wanted them to feel small, worthless, and powerless every single day of their lives. That's why he made the fights public. If he truly wanted discipline, he could have punished someone privately, quietly, out of sight. But he didn't want quiet. He wanted an audience. He wanted a crowd standing in fear, forced to like prisoners at an execution. Because when humiliation becomes public, it spreads. One person bleeds and everyone feels weaker. One person falls and everyone learns what helplessness looks like. The master understood something terrifying. Fear is contagious. So he staged cruelty like theater. He chose open ground where everyone could see clearly. He made people stand close enough to hear every breath, every groan, every desperate stumble in the dirt. He made sure the enslaved people's eyes were locked on the victim, not out of choice, but out of forced obedience. And while the victim fought for survival, the master watched like it was sport. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he clapped, sometimes he mocked the person struggling to stand. He'd throw insults like stones. Pathetic, worthless, look at you. And those words were more than cruelty. They were weapons. Because the master wasn't just humiliating the fighter, he was humiliating everyone who shared that same fate. He was telling the crowd, "This is what you are. This is what you deserve. This is what I can do whenever I want." That's why he turned human suffering into entertainment. On plantations, masters often hosted gatherings, food, drinks, conversation, laughter. But in this place, the master's favorite entertainment wasn't music or storytelling. It was power. The power to command two human beings into violence. The power to decide who gets hurt. The power to turn people into animals in the dirt. forced to fight under a sky that didn't care. And the humiliation didn't stop when the fight ended. The chosen victim didn't just lose physically. They lost socially too. They were forced to return to the cabins, with everyone having seen them broken. Some enslaved people looked at them with pity. Some looked away because it reminded them of their own fragile safety. And worst of all, some were too afraid to even comfort them, because kindness itself could be punished. That's the true horror. The master didn't just want to harm the body. He wanted to destroy unity. He wanted to break connection. He wanted people too terrified to support each other. Because when enslaved people comfort each other, they heal. When they heal, they regain strength. And when they regain strength, they become dangerous. So he used public humiliation to poison hope, to make the enslaved feel alone even in a crowd. And for the master, that was the real reward. Not the fight, not the blood, but the moment he could look at a full crowd of terrified people and know they were all trapped inside his sick performance. But the master made one mistake. He believed humiliation always wins. He believed shame would keep people silent forever. He didn't realize that sometimes humiliation doesn't break a person. Sometimes it transforms them. Because there comes a moment when someone stops caring about embarrassment, stops caring about pain, stops caring about what happens next. And when that moment arrives, entertainment turns into rebellion. And the crowd that once watched in fear starts watching in shock. On this plantation, fear wasn't occasional, it was constant, like the air everyone breathed. It settled into bones, followed people into their sleep, and woke them before dawn. And where fear lived, silence followed close behind. The enslaved people learned early that silence was survival. You didn't speak unless spoken to. You didn't ask questions. You didn't complain. You didn't react, even when your heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might tear through your chest. Because on a plantation ruled by cruelty, every word carried risk. When the master held his ritual fights, the silence became heavier than chains. Dozens of people stood together, yet no one truly felt together. No whispers, no gasps, no cries. Even turning your head the wrong way could be noticed. Overseers watched faces closely, looking for fear, anger, sympathy, anything they could punish. The enslaved learned to control their expressions better than their pain. Eyes down, jaw tight, body still. Because showing emotion could be seen as defiance. And the worst part, they weren't silent because they didn't care. They were silent because caring out loud could get someone killed. Fear isolated them from one another. A man might want to comfort a friend who had been beaten, but he wouldn't move, because kindness could be interpreted as resistance. A mother might want to cry when her son was chosen, but she swallowed the sound, because tears could bring punishment to the whole family, so fear taught them to suffer alone together. At night, inside the cabins, the silence changed but never disappeared. Voices dropped to whispers. Stories were told carefully. Names of the master were avoided, as if speaking them might summon him. People shared warnings instead of dreams. Keep your head down. Don't be noticed. Survive today. Hope became dangerous. Anyone who seemed hopeful stood out. Anyone who looked confident attracted attention. Anyone who carried themselves with quiet strength risked becoming the next example. That's how fear controlled the plantation, more effectively than any whip. It trained the enslaved to police themselves. And yet, inside that silence, something else was growing. Because silence doesn't mean emptiness. Behind lowered eyes were memories of stolen children. Behind clenched teeth were years of hunger and exhaustion. Behind stiff bodies were hearts beating with anger. grief, and rage that had nowhere to go. The master believed silence meant obedience, but he misunderstood something vital. Silence is not the absence of feeling, it is the containment of it. And when fear is stretched too far, when silence is forced for too long, it doesn't disappear. It hardens, it condenses, it waits. So on the night the weakest slave was chosen, the crowd stood as silent as ever. No one moved, no one spoke, no one protested. But inside many of them, something shifted. Because as they watched that man step forward, thin, bruised, exhausted, they didn't just feel fear anymore. They felt recognition. They saw themselves. And for the first time, silence wasn't only about survival. It was about anticipation. Because sometimes the quiet before the storm isn't empty. It's listening, waiting, for the moment when fear finally cracks and something far more dangerous takes its place. The selection was always the worst part, because it turned every enslaved person into a possible target, and it happened so suddenly that nobody could prepare for it. One moment you're standing in line, trying to look invisible, and the next moment, you're praying your name doesn't get spoken, praying the master's finger doesn't stop on you. That night, the air felt wrong from the beginning. The sun had barely disappeared, yet the plantation already carried that familiar tension, like the ground itself remembered what was about to happen. People were gathered in silence, forced into place, their bodies aching from the day's labor. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees and the occasional shuffle of feet in dirt. Then he arrived, the master, not rushing, not angry, calm, because to him this wasn't punishment. This was pleasure. He walked slowly, like a man entering a room he owned, which he did. Not just the land, but the lives standing before him. His boots pressed into the soil as if he was stamping ownership into the earth. The overseers stood nearby, stiff and watchful, weapons and ropes ready. They didn't look at the enslaved like people either. They looked at them like tools lined up against the wall, tools that could be broken and replaced. And then the master began the part he loved most. He surveyed them, not quickly, but carefully. His eyes moved over faces, shoulders, arms, chests, like a butcher deciding where to cut. And the enslaved people understood what he was doing. They felt it. The gaze wasn't just observation, it was a hunt. Some tried to shrink into themselves. Some stared at the ground so hard it felt like their eyes might burn through it. Some forced their breathing to stay calm, even though their hearts were pounding like drums. Because the master wasn't looking for the strongest, he was looking for the one who would break the best. His gaze paused on a few bodies, testing, measuring. A man with a limp, a boy too thin for his age, an older worker whose hands shook from exhaustion. And then his eyes landed on someone different. A quiet, enslaved man who rarely spoke, not famous on the plantation, not known for fighting, not known for rebellion. Just existing. But that night, existing wasn't enough. The man looked worn down, skin tight over bone, bruises hidden under fabric, eyes shadowed with tiredness. He didn't look like someone built for violence. He looked like someone built for survival, barely. A few people in the crowd noticed the master staring too long, and a wave of dread ran through them, because they recognized that stare. That stare meant the choice was forming. The enslaved man didn't move. He couldn't. If he shifted, it could be seen as fear. If he lifted his head, it could be seen as disrespect. If he tried to step back, it could be seen as guilt. So he stayed still, like a statue. But inside him, everything was screaming. Then the master smiled. Not a warm smile, a cruel smile, the kind of smile that says, "I found my entertainment." He raised his hand and pointed. "You." That single word cut through the silence like a blade. For a moment, the plantation felt like it stopped breathing. The enslaved man's stomach dropped. Because in 1 second, his entire life became a stage. 2 overseers moved forward immediately. Rough hands grabbed his arms. They pulled him out of line like he wasn't even human. The crowd didn't move. They couldn't. But their eyes followed him, and those eyes carried something heavy. Pity, fear, helplessness. Some wanted to speak, some wanted to beg, some wanted to step forward and take his place. But nobody did, because the master had designed it this way. He didn't just select a victim. He selected a lesson. He wanted everyone to see what happens when you're weak, what happens when you're unlucky, what happens when the master is bored. The victim was pushed into the open dirt ring, and the master's voice came again, cold and satisfied. Choose him an opponent. And that's when the enslaved people knew. This wasn't just another ritual. This one felt different, because the master wasn't just selecting the weakest. He was selecting someone who looked like the fight would be over fast, so he could enjoy the cruelty longer. But what he didn't understand, what he couldn't see, was that the man he had chosen wasn't only weak from hunger and labor. He was weak from carrying too much pain for too long. And sometimes when a person carries that kind of pain, they don't break, they snap. And the night the master pointed at him was the night the plantation unknowingly selected its biggest mistake. The moment the chosen man was shoved into the open space, everything around him felt unreal, like the world had tilted and the plantation had transformed into something darker than a workplace. The crowd formed a loose circle, not because they wanted to, but because they were forced to. They stood like silent walls made of fear, their faces blank, their eyes trapped on the center of the dirt ring. That dirt ring was not an official arena. There were no ropes, no rules, no mercy, just a patch of ground beaten hard by boots and repeated suffering. The soil was compacted in places where bodies had fallen before. There were marks that never truly went away, scuffs, stains, shallow dents, tiny graves of past humiliations. The master sat in a chair near the front like a judge, but he wasn't there for justice. He was there for pleasure. The overseers hovered behind him, ready to step in if anyone tried to interfere. Or, if the fight didn't go the way the master wanted, the enslaved man stood in the center, his breathing tight, his shoulders tense. He tried to steady himself, but he could feel his heart beat in his throat. His hands were shaking, not from fear alone, but from exhaustion, hunger, and the cold certainty that this was never meant to be fair. Then his opponent stepped forward, a bigger man, a stronger man, a man who looked like the master's obvious choice, built to dominate, built to crush the weak, won quickly. But the opponent didn't look proud. He looked trapped too. Forced to fight, forced to win, because losing wasn't an option. On plantations like this, the winner didn't win freedom. He only won another day alive, and that was the cruelty of it. 2 enslaved men were being used like weapons against each other, one chosen to break, the other chosen to do the breaking. The master leaned forward slightly, like he could taste what was coming. He gave no speech, no instructions, no countdown. He didn't need to. The silence itself was the signal. The air was thick, the wind barely moved, and the crowd held its breath as if breathing too loudly might change the outcome. Then it started. The larger man stepped in first, swinging fast and hard, aiming for a quick ending. The first blow landed with a sound that made several people flinch, even if their faces stayed still. The chosen man stumbled backward, his feet slipping in the dirt, his body folding slightly under the impact. Everyone expected him to fall, That's how it always went. But he didn't. He caught himself. Barely. The larger man pressed forward again, striking with the confidence of someone who believed the fight was already decided. Another hit, another shove, another painful stumble. Dust rose around their feet, floating in the air like smoke from something burning. The master watched closely. And here's the sick part. He wasn't watching with anger, he was watching with excitement. He wanted the weak one to suffer publicly. He wanted the crowd to absorb the message. And yet, something felt different this time. Because the chosen man didn't panic, he didn't cry, he didn't beg. His face wasn't pleading. It was empty. Not numb, but controlled. Like he had already accepted whatever came next. Like he'd walked into the dirt ring, knowing there were only two outcomes. Die slowly, or fight like a man who's already dead inside. The larger opponent swung again, expecting the weak man to fold. But the weak man moved, not quickly, at first. Not gracefully, but with purpose. He raised his arms, blocked the strike, and stepped sideways with the tiniest shift of balance that caught everyone off guard. It wasn't the move of a helpless victim. It was the move of someone who had been studying survival quietly for a long time. The crowd felt it before they understood it. That sudden tension. That strange moment when people realize the story isn't going the usual way. The master's smile wavered, because the dirt ring was supposed to be a place of guaranteed humiliation. A place where the weak always fell. But as the chosen man steadied his feet, dust clinging to his skin like ash, he lifted his head, and for the first time, he looked straight ahead. Not at the crowd, not at his opponent. Toward the master, and in that look was something that didn't belong on a plantation. Not fear, not begging, but something colder, something dangerous, a silent warning. You wanted a show, now you're going to watch what you created. The fight was no longer just blows and dirt. It became a turning point, because once the first punch is thrown, everyone watches the body. But when the victim doesn't fall, everyone starts watching the master. And that's when the real horror begins. Because the dirt ring wasn't just holding two men fighting. It was holding something much bigger, a lifetime of pain, finally rising to the surface. At first, the crowd thought it was going to end like every other time. A few punches, a stumble, a collapse. Because that's what the master always arranged. He didn't want a real contest, he wanted a quick, humiliating defeat that proved his power and crushed any spark of pride in the people watching. But then the weak one did something nobody expected. He didn't fall apart. He didn't swing wildly like a desperate man. He didn't rush forward with blind anger. He didn't beg for mercy. Instead, he fought differently. And that difference was terrifying. Because the enslaved people weren't watching a man trying to win. They were watching a man who had reached a place beyond fear. The larger opponent threw another heavy strike, confident, expecting the weak man to crumble. But the weak man moved his body just enough to make the blow land wrong, glancing off instead of smashing down. He shifted his weight like he'd learned the language of pain, like he understood exactly what the body can endure and what it can't. It was small movements at first. A step back at the right second, a block that didn't look strong, but was placed perfectly. A tilt of the shoulders that made a punch miss by inches. And each time the bigger man swung and failed to finish him, something strange happened. The bigger man got angrier, and the weak one got calmer. That calmness was unnatural in a place like this. On a plantation, calm meant one of two things. Either a man had given up, or a man had decided he didn't care what happened next. And as the fight continued, it became clear which one it was. The weak. One didn't fight like someone afraid of pain. He fought like someone who had lived in pain for so long that pain no longer scared him. Every bruise, every scar, every hard day in the fields, every night starving, every humiliation, it had sharpened him into something quiet and dangerous, like a blade hidden under rags. The crowd could feel it, because this wasn't just a fight. It was a transformation happening right in front of them. The master leaned forward again, expecting the moment of collapse, but the weak man kept standing, kept moving, kept surviving, and slowly, the bigger man started to lose control. His punches became heavier, sloppier. His breathing became loud. His confidence began leaking out of him like blood. The weak man, meanwhile, looked almost empty, like his mind had gone somewhere else, somewhere colder, because deep down, he wasn't fighting the opponent. He was fighting the ritual. He was fighting the humiliation. He was fighting the master's invisible hand that forced this into existence. Then the weak man struck back. Not with a wild swing, but with precision. A sharp hit to the ribs when the bigger man overreached. A sudden blow to the jaw as the opponent's guard dropped. A step forward at the exact second the bigger man expected him to retreat. And the sound of those hits felt different. Because it wasn't desperation. It was calculation. The crowd didn't gasp out loud, but inside, many of them did. Because they understood the terrifying truth. The master hadn't chosen a helpless victim. He had chosen someone who had been holding rage quietly for years. A man who had learned how to survive by staying invisible until the moment it mattered. The biggest shock wasn't that he could fight. It was how he carried himself while doing it. No screaming, no panic, no fear in his eyes, just a stillness, like a storm waiting behind his ribs. Even the opponent began to realize something was wrong. He'd been picked because he was supposed to win easily, but now he could feel it. Every time he tried to crush this man, the man refused to break, and when a victim refuses to break, the entire structure of cruelty starts to shake. The master noticed too. His smile faded more. His posture stiffened. His fingers tightened around the edge of his chair. Because the master didn't just want violence. He wanted control, and control was slipping. The weak man was no longer playing his part. He was rewriting the story. And in a system built on humiliation, that is the most dangerous thing a person can do. Because if one weak man can stand up, then everyone watching starts to wonder something they were never allowed to wonder before. What if the master isn't untouchable? And that thought, just that thought, was a threat bigger than any fist. That's why the master's eyes darkened, because the real horror wasn't the fight itself. The real horror was what the fight was awakening in everyone who had been forced to stay silent. And the weak man, he wasn't just fighting differently. He was fighting like a warning, like a curse. Like the beginning of something the master would never be able to stop again. The turning point didn't arrive with a scream or a dramatic pause. It arrived quietly, so quietly that for half a second, no one realized history on that plantation had just shifted. The larger man swung again, harder than before, driven by anger now instead of confidence. His breath was ragged. His movements were rushed. He wanted this to end, wanted the story to return to the way it was supposed to go. But that was the moment he made his mistake. He overcommitted. Just for an instant, his balance slipped, one foot sliding slightly in the dirt, his shoulder dropping as his weight moved too far forward. And the weak man saw it, not with panic, with clarity. In that split second, years of suffering sharpened into focus. Hunger, chains, laughter from the master's chair, the faces of people forced to watch and learn helplessness. The weak man stepped in, Not back, not away, forward. The strike wasn't loud, it wasn't wild, it was precise. A short, brutal blow that landed exactly where it needed to, followed by another before the larger man could even react. The sound of impact cut through the air, sharp and final, like wood cracking under pressure. The larger man staggered. That had never happened before. The crowd froze, not breathing, not blinking, as they watched something forbidden unfold. The winner was losing. The man chosen to dominate was suddenly struggling to stay upright. The master shot up from his chair. His face changed, not to rage, not yet, but to disbelief. Because this wasn't part of the ritual. This wasn't part of the script he had written and repeated for years. The weak man pressed forward again. Still calm, still silent, still terrifyingly focused. Another hit landed, sending the larger man back a step. Dust rose around them, hanging in the air like smoke from a gunshot. And in that moment, everyone understood something at once. This fight was no longer about humiliation. It was about survival and reversal. The larger man dropped to one knee, his hands digging into the dirt, chest heaving. He tried to stand, but his body hesitated, betrayed by exhaustion and shock. That's when the plantation truly went silent. Not the forced silence of fear. A different kind of silence. The kind that comes when people witness something they were never meant to see. The master shouted,
"Enough!"
The word cracked through the air, sharp with panic. But the weak man didn't stop immediately. Because for the first time in his life, someone else was begging. And that single second, when the master's voice trembled, when his command carried fear instead of authority, changed everything. The weak man finally stepped back. Not because he was ordered to, but because he chose to. The larger man collapsed fully into the dirt, defeated alive but broken. And the crowd stood there, stunned, staring at a scene that should not have been possible. The master's ritual, his perfect system of power, had failed in front of everyone. His weapon had turned blunt. His certainty had cracked. His dominance had been exposed as fragile. The master looked around, scanning the faces of the enslaved people. And for the first time, he didn't see only fear. He saw something else flickering behind their eyes. Shock, confusion, and the most dangerous thing of all, awareness. Because once people see that power can be challenged, even once, it never looks the same again. The weak man stood there, chest rising and falling, fists clenched, dust clinging to his skin. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply stood. And that image burned itself into everyone's memory. The weakest man on the plantation, standing over the fallen proof of the master's authority. The master realized it too. That's why his face hardened. Because humiliation, when it belongs to a tyrant, demands revenge. And in that moment, while the crowd was still frozen, while the air still felt unreal, the master made a decision that would echo long after the dirt settled. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because the turning point of the fight wasn't just physical. It was symbolic. The ritual had been broken. And when a ritual of cruelty breaks, someone always pays for it. The only question left was, who? The moment the larger man collapsed, something inside the master snapped. For years, decades perhaps, everything on that plantation had moved according to his will. His word decided who worked, who ate, who was punished, who suffered, and who lived another day. Control was not just his power, it was his identity. And now, in front of everyone, that control had cracked. The master stood up so suddenly his chair scraped loudly against the ground. The sound echoed across the clearing, sharp and jarring, breaking the frozen silence. His face was no longer amused, no longer entertained. It was furious. This was not how the ritual was supposed to end. He had chosen the weakest to remind everyone of their place. He had arranged humiliation, not resistance. He had planned fear, not defiance. And yet here he was, watching his chosen victim stand, breathing hard but unbroken, while the winner lay in the dirt. The master shouted again, louder this time, his voice strained and ugly. "Get him away from there!" But his words landed differently now. The overseers hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but that hesitation mattered, because hesitation meant uncertainty, and uncertainty had never existed in this ritual before. The master noticed it, and that made him angrier. He began barking orders, his voice rising, cracking, overlapping itself. He demanded chains. He demanded punishment. He demanded that the weak man be dragged away immediately. But something had shifted in the air. The enslaved people still didn't move, still didn't speak. Yet the silence felt different. It wasn't empty obedience anymore. It was watchful. The master paced back and forth, hands shaking, his face red with rage and embarrassment. Every step he took stirred dust into the air, like the ground itself was unsettled by his fury. He glanced at the crowd again, searching for the familiar sight of lowered eyes and broken posture. But he didn't find it everywhere. Some heads were still down, but not all. Some eyes had lifted, just slightly. Some faces held shock instead of fear, and the master felt it. The thing he had always believed could never happen, he felt exposed. Because power, when it is absolute, relies on illusion. The illusion that it cannot be challenged, that resistance is pointless, that the outcome is always known in advance. Tonight, that illusion had shattered. The master's anger grew more frantic because he understood the danger, not of the weak man alone, but of what the crowd had witnessed. You can punish a person, but you can't punish a memory. You can't erase the sight of the weakest man standing victorious in the dirt. The master pointed wildly, accusing, threatening, promising consequences. His words tumbled out harsh and fast, no longer measured, no longer confident. This wasn't authority speaking anymore. This was panic. Because deep down, the master knew something that terrified him. Fear had kept the plantation obedient, and fear had just failed. He ordered the overseers to take the weak man away, not to restore order, but to reclaim dominance. To prove, one way or another, that the rituals still belonged to him. But even as the overseers moved, the master's eyes never left the man who had humiliated him. Not with triumph, with hatred, because the master had lost more than a fight that night. He had lost control of the story he'd been telling for years. The story where he was untouchable. The story where the weak always fell. The story where resistance never worked. And now, standing in the dust of his own broken ritual, the master understood a truth he had spent his life denying. Once control is questioned, it can never fully be restored. That realization terrified him more than any rebellion ever could. And that terror is what made the next part inevitable. Because when tyrants lose control in public, they don't reflect. They retaliate. And the master was already planning how to make the plantation remember who he believed was still in charge, even if it meant drowning the memory of that night in blood, even if it meant hunting the man who proved, if only once, that the master was not invincible. When the fight ended, the dirt settled, but the danger didn't. In fact, the real nightmare began after the crowd was dismissed, because on plantations like this, survival wasn't decided in the ring. It was decided in what came next. The master didn't speak at first. Not immediately. He stood there stiff and boiling, staring at the weak man, as if he were looking at something unnatural, something that shouldn't exist. The humiliation had cut him deeper than any blade, not because the master cared about fairness, but because he cared about one thing above all else: never being questioned. And that night, the entire plantation had witnessed his authority get shaken. Even if no one said a word, everyone had seen it. The master turned sharply and stormed toward the overseers, his voice low, venomous, and full of promise. "Take him." Those two words were colder than the night air. The overseers moved quickly, not because they wanted to, but because they understood how fragile the master's mood was now. When a man like that is embarrassed, he doesn't calm down. He looks for someone to destroy. They stepped toward the weak man with chains already in their hands, heavy iron links that clinked like a warning bell. The sound alone was terrifying, because on a plantation, chains meant more than restraint. Chains meant disappearance. The enslaved people in the crowd watched without moving, their bodies frozen. They wanted to help. Some wanted to stand up. But they didn't, because the master's punishment didn't just fall on one person. Punishment was contagious too. If someone spoke, the master might punish 10. If someone stepped forward, the master might punish a family. If someone resisted, the master might make an example so brutal the plantation would never forget it. So the crowd did what fear trained them to do. They watched, silent. The weak man didn't run, not yet. He stood there, chest rising and falling, hands still trembling from the fight. His opponent lay in the dirt behind him, proof that the ritual was broken. But the weak man already understood what everyone else understood too. Winning wasn't the end. Winning was the beginning of a different kind of suffering, because now the master wasn't just angry. He was threatened. And when a master feels threatened, he stops caring about punishment as discipline. He moves into punishment as revenge. The overseers grabbed the weak man by the arms, trying to drag him away like a captured animal. One of them twisted his wrist, forcing his body forward. The iron clinked again, louder now, as if the chains were eager to finish what the fight started. The master watched from behind them, breathing heavy, eyes hard. He didn't want the weak man punished quietly. He wanted it done in a way that erased the memory of the fight. He wanted the plantation to learn. Yes, he won, and look what it cost him. Because the master couldn't allow a victory to become inspiration. In his mind, that victory had to be turned into a warning. And the master had endless ways to do it. A whipping so severe the back would never heal. A cage in the heat where days felt like slow death. A brand, a scar, a mark that said, property, forever. A disappearance into a distant plantation, sold away like a broken tool. The enslaved people whispered about punishments like that in the cabins at night, careful not to say too much. They shared stories of people who stood out too much and were erased for it. And that's what the crowd feared most. Not the pain, but the erasure. Because punishment wasn't only physical, it was designed to destroy a person's identity, to make them vanish from everyone's world without leaving a trace. The weak man's victory had made the master lose control. Now the master needed to reclaim it, and the simplest way to reclaim control was to crush the victor in a way that made everyone regret witnessing the win. The master began shouting at the overseers again. "Don't let him breathe. Don't let him look proud. Make him remember who owns him." Each word was a promise of cruelty. But there was another layer to this aftermath. Something quieter. Because the enslaved people watching weren't only afraid for the weak man, they were afraid of what the master might do to all of them. If one man's victory could embarrass the master, then the master might punish the whole plantation out of rage. A harsher workload, less food, more whippings, random accusations, any excuse to remind everyone, "This place belongs to me." That's how terror worked. It didn't need logic. It only needed power. But as the overseers tightened their grip on the weak man, something changed in his expression. Not fear, not panic, a cold awareness, because he knew exactly what was coming. He knew the master would never forgive this, and when a man knows forgiveness isn't possible, he reaches a point where obedience no longer matters. Where the future is already ruined, and when the future is already ruined, a person becomes capable of anything. That's what made the aftermath so dangerous. The master thought the fight was the rebellion. He was wrong. The fight was only the spark. The real threat was the fact that the weak man had tasted something he was never supposed to taste. Power, even for a moment. And once you taste it, once you feel what it's like to stand instead of kneel, it becomes impossible to forget. The master could punish the body, but he could never punish that memory out of existence. And that's why the plantation held its breath that night. Because everyone knew what was coming next. The master was going to make an example. The only question was, would the weak man be there to suffer it? Or would he vanish before the chains could close? Because one thing was certain. After humiliating the master in front of the entire plantation, the weak man was no longer just a slave in the master's eyes. He was a threat. And threats don't get punished. They get erased. That night didn't end with closure. It ended with a missing man and a plantation that never felt safe again. After the master gave his order, the overseers moved fast. Chains were ready. Ropes were ready. Rage was ready. The weak man's victory had humiliated the master in front of everyone, and humiliation, on a plantation like this, was treated like a crime worse than violence, because violence could be controlled. But embarrassment made the master look human, and the master could not allow that. The enslaved people were forced back toward the quarters, heads down, footsteps quiet, every heartbeat heavy with dread. No one dared to ask what would happen next. Nobody dared to speak the weak man's name out loud. But inside the cabins whispers spread like smoke. Some said they heard the master shouting deep into the night. Some said they heard chains clinking like teeth. Some said they heard the barking of dogs far beyond the fields. And then, just before dawn, a strange truth appeared. The weak man was gone, not lying broken in a shed, not locked in a cage, not dragged back to the quarters. Gone. At first, it didn't make sense. How does someone vanish from a plantation that was designed like a trap? Patrols watched the roads. Overseers guarded the edges. The river itself could swallow a body if you tried crossing wrong. Yet when the master's men searched, they found nothing. No footprints leading out. No blood trail. No sign of struggle. Only the empty space where a victim should have been. And that's when the fear changed shape. Because on plantations, escape wasn't only dangerous, it was rare. So the disappearance didn't feel like a normal runaway story. It felt like something unnatural. Some enslaved people believed he escaped into the woods, slipping between trees like a ghost. Mississippi forests were thick, dark, and endless in places, perfect for hiding, but brutal for survival. People whispered that maybe he crawled through the swamp, mud swallowing his tracks, water covering his scent. Others believed something even darker, that someone helped him. Because sometimes on plantations, hidden networks existed, people risking everything to save one life. A sympathetic worker, a secret path, a wagon leaving before sunrise, a stolen coat. A moment of mercy bought with silence. But no one could prove anything, because truth was dangerous, and truth could get you killed. The master, however, didn't care about proof. He cared about blame. He became obsessed. Enraged, hunting. He ordered the hounds brought out. He sent men riding the roads. He demanded every cabin be searched, every tool shed, every tree line, every creek. And when they found nothing, his anger turned on the people left behind. The plantation felt different after that morning. The air was sharper, work was harsher. Punishments became random, like the master was striking the ground, hoping the missing man